Not only is America not a Christian nation, but according to this American lawyer and theologian, it's a demonic nation. Let's talk about it. Hi, I'm Colton. I grew up a Pentecostal pastor's kid, went to school to get degrees in historical Christian theology, and I don't think January 6th is anywhere close to one of the worst things that's happened in American history. But it is a particularly good illustration of what this video is about. We saw an enraged mob of violent Christian nationalists carry American flags and Jesus Save banners into the Capitol during an attempted coup. And in the aftermath, I remember seeing one pastor say that this was a revival, not a riot. I saw another pastor say that the insurrection was comparable to the walls of Jericho falling down. That's how they viewed it. And more than a few Christians defended it as the hand of God moving through patriots. There was this guy named William Stringfellow who was a civil rights attorney, an activist, and a theologian who lived in Harlem during the 1960s. He wrote this book called An Ethic for Christians and Other Aliens in a Strange Land. Stringfellow used the language from Ephesians chapter 6, verse 12 to talk about America being the demonic principality of the power of death. In this passage, someone, purportedly Paul, although that's hotly contested by the scholarship, says that we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. And in context, this is essentially naming the unseen forces that work through empires and institutions and ideologies. Not just like metaphors, but Stringfellow actually took this seriously. For him, these powers and principalities are the spiritual and institutional realities that shape human life, and often without our awareness. Stringfellow didn't think that demonic principalities came wearing horns and red capes, but they came dressed in flags and standing in pulpits, using the language of freedom, family, and faith. He saw them as real forces that were spiritual, systemic, and seductive. He saw them operating as governments, corporations, and even churches. Really, any institution that takes on life of its own and demands allegiance, resists accountability, and functions to preserve its own survival at the expense of truth. Stringfellow said that these forces aren't always obviously evil, that they pretend to be good because they disguise themselves as righteous and they speak in the name of God while dealing in death. Put simply, he saw America as a principality pretending to be God. For Stringfellow, this is why so many churches have lost the capacity to tell the truth. And this is why Christians defend war as holy or see billionaires as blessed, use law and order language like it's sacred, but then mock mercy. No wonder so many churches have prioritized the idea of personal salvation. It allows you to ignore systemic sin, and you start to see flags treated with more reverence than the cross. Stringfellow believed that when the church endorses or baptizes empire, that what it's doing is worshiping death, because the one thing that the powers always wield is death. Not just physical death, but spiritual death, the death of imagination, the death of empathy. It's kind of funny that we're seeing so much language come up today from American evangelicals talking about toxic empathy. Crazy. Stringfellow says that this is the death that comes when you no longer believe anything can change. And so you give yourself over to the way that things are. And he says that this is how the powers win, not by making you serve them consciously, but by making you believe they're inevitable. And he says that they do this strategically, and he actually outlines 8 strategies that the powers use to sustain their influence and subdue their conscience. For time purposes, I can only cover probably 3. One of these strategies is the denial of truth. He says that the powers lie blatantly and systemically, that they distort the facts and suppress evidence to amain the illusion of righteousness. And I think you can see this clearly in the way that American institutions dismiss or minimize the climate crisis, even when the scientific consensus is clear, or in a way that somebody might claim an election was stolen with no credible proof, using the lie to justify further authoritarian responses. or even how they erase the human toll of immigration policies by not acknowledging the deaths or the trauma caused by detentions, deportations, and border enforcement. Another strategy he outlines is what he calls doublespeak and overtalk in the Orwellian sense. And he's not just talking about lying here. Here he's talking about drowning the truth in euphemism and noise. So think about the way that we use terms like enhanced interrogation to mean torture, or collateral damage to mean dead civilians. Pundits and politicians will often flood the discourse with slogans like law and order, things that obscure who's actually making the laws and whose order is being preserved in the first place. And I think that when the language is corrupted, so is the conscience. Then there's surveillance and harassment. Stringfellow says that powers protect themselves by targeting dissent. And you can see this in the way that law enforcement agencies are starting to track protesters with facial recognition, or even as quietly as IRS audits and donor blacklists for faith leaders who challenge Christian nationalism. That's happening. Keep in mind, this was written in the 1970s, the early 70s. He talks about journalists facing threats for exposing state or corporate wrongdoing, and clergy who speak out being dismissed as, just political or divisive or even unpatriotic. The goal here isn't just to punish, it's to intimidate, to discourage anyone else from stepping out of line. And this is why Stringfellow didn't just call the church to critique the state. He was actually calling the church to exercise the state, to name the idols clearly, and to unmask the spiritual lies that are there beneath the political power. Stringfellow was begging the church to refuse to worship at the altars of relevance, respectability, and return on investment. And in a world where even the church can become possessed by the spirit of empire, Stringfellow believed that the only faithful church is the one that looks like Christ, poor, despised, and truth-telling, willing to die rather than to kill.